I think that is the literal definition of a smattering of applause. So welcome. I think we've got a relatively short time to get started, so I'm going to invite these lovely colleagues down here to either find a seat or take your conversations out into the hall, because I think we want to dive right in. And my name is Jamie Bennett. I'm lucky enough to be the executive director of something called ArtPlace America. And by dint of that, I travel the country a lot and do a lot of these sorts of panels. And I get to be on lots of panels with people I respect, and I get to be on lots of panels with people I like. And I think this is the first panel I've ever been on where I like and respect everyone who's on it. So this is a rare treat for me. So we've got about 50 minutes to do a little bit of a conversation around issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and funding. And I'm on stage with Susan Fader from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, with Kamilah Henderson from the Southeast Michigan Community Foundation, and Margaret Morton from the Ford Foundation. And what we thought we might do with our time together is allow each of them to ground you a little bit in their organization, in their work, in sort of the position from which they're speaking. Talk for a minute or two about sort of philanthropy and some of the ways that these issues play out broadly across the field. Talk a little bit about the field of music, classical music in particular. And then with sort of the last 15 minutes or so, 10 minutes or so, would love to invite some of your voices to join us with questions or short speeches disguised as questions, which is probably more likely. So if that's agreeable, I think we'll dig in. So Susan, let's start with you. You work for an extraordinary national funder that focuses on the arts and humanities. And in many ways, you guys have sort of, from the beginning of the foundation, have had sort of issues of racial diversity, equity, inclusion baked into the DNA of the foundation. So will you ground us a little bit in the foundation and how some of that work has played out?
Sure. Andrew W. Mellon Foundation was founded in 1969. It was a successor organization to two foundations established by the children of Andrew W. Mellon, Elsa and Paul. And from the beginning, it was taking the interest more of the children than of Andrew, who was a robber baron, in institutions of higher education and the arts. About 30 years ago, we established a program called the Milanese Undergraduate Fellowship Program, which sought to change the diversity of the humanities academic environment by nurturing students beginning in their sophomore years of college who identified as wanting to go to graduate school in the humanities. And this program takes them through with a series of mentorships and community building, both in their own institutions and across the colleges that are covered. Started with about 8 institutions. There are now about 50 involved in Mellon Mays. They've had about 5,000 students go through the program. There are upwards of 700 PhDs. They include the president of Kenyon College, the provost of Morehouse College, tenured faculty across the humanities. If we had stopped that program after 10 years, there would have been some success, and we could have declared victory and moved on. But instead, we have stayed with this program now for nearly 30 years. And the trajectory has gone something like this. And it's now baked into those institutions. There's summer research programs. The students meet each other. And it's been an inspiration for the foundation low on these 30 years. And we've been the sole funder. It's been about $100 million investment. I think it was $100 million really well spent. We've also historically supported the HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, on and on and on. I've been program officer in the performing arts for the last 10 years. I think it's safe to say that we were not doing terribly much in the areas of diversity and inclusion when I arrived. Sphinx was an early grant I made to support the Sphinx tours. But what's happened over the last 10 years, I think has been multi-faceted. I think you look at the Obama presidency, you look at the changing demographics, you look at work that has been done by grant makers in the arts, which is my service organization, which has really been pushing funders to think about diversity, equity, inclusion. You look at the Holly Sidford report that came out in 2011 on fusing arts, culture, and social change. I think that's what it was called. And I think it has become, for Mellon also particularly, the hiring of an African-American president in 2013, African American board chair. So we've had an internal look at what it's been that we have been doing. We did our first strategic plan in 2014. We had our first staff retreat, and gradually, I would say, diversity, equity, and inclusion has become baked into everything we do, but I would say very much inspired by Mellon Mays. Within the Arts and Cultural Heritage Program, which was formed during our strategic plan by the merger of the Performing Arts Program and our Art History, Conservation, and Museums Program, we really are using diversity, equity, and inclusion as a lens for just about everything we do. Which means a great expansion into funding culturally specific institutions, funding activities of not culturally specific institutions that are looking to improve their DEI work, professional development for students and young professionals, and within arts and cultural heritage, particularly expanding the pathways. I prefer the word pathways to pipeline. For students below the college and university level, because Mellon has always been in that upper range. We used to have on our website, we do not fund K-12 activities. So I've now taken that off, and we're making tentative forays. I like to say to our trustees, for students that have identified as pre-professional. So I think I'll stop there.
Great. Yeah, no, that's fabulous.
Okay.
Now, Kamilah, you work for a very different kind of entity, right? A community foundation is a specific thing that is sort of accountable to all of the citizens in a place and needs to reflect all of them. So ground us a little bit in the foundation itself and then how some of these issues play out and inform your programs and work.
So at the Community Foundation, we're intentionally trying to cast a wide net and make it so that as many people as possible can see possibilities for themselves within our funding opportunities. So there are lots of areas of focus through special initiatives, but for the most part, we're serving the 7-county region in Southeast Michigan, and we're making sure that people across those 7-county regions can have access to funding that is very much, so if they have an idea about something, they don't have to find a niche that we have. They can come to us and say, this is a thing that I want to see happening in my neighborhood, in my community, and we're doing our best to make room for them so that our grant-making priorities stay quite broad and intentionally so. So I'll say within the arts and culture portfolio, the big thing that I've seen us doing very well with is some system building work where we're supporting groups like Creative Mini and Culture Source and the Cultural Data Project that's now Data Arts, or focusing on innovation with organizations that are really down on the ground serving the highest need children like Living Arts or Signal Returns, very unique work in Eastern Market, or Sphinx, which is what we're all here for today. And then also supporting those organizations that have a long history of innovation, but deep roots in communities in Southeastern Michigan, like University Musical Society partnering with Michigan Opera Theater to bring their work out of the buildings and the institutions they're kind of serving in and into neighborhoods. And so I'd say, thinking in terms of equity, it's a priority for me and for the Community Foundation to be laser focused on this idea of who has access and who benefits, but even more so, who actually shows up to apply. So when we're casting that wide net, the question becomes for us, who actually submits a grant proposal and who actually is making themselves one of the possibilities to be counted as a who benefits. So thinking in that way and heading into this year, I think it's going to be an exciting time for arts and culture at the Community Foundation.
That's fantastic. Now, Margaret, you guys at Ford went through your strategic planning process, and you work for a foundation that has a singular focus, laser focus on inequality, and that plays out through programs overseen by 3 vice presidents. So talk to us a little bit about sort of how you approach this work.
Sure. So I'm Margaret Morton, and I am the program officer for Arts and Culture, which is part of Creativity and Free Expression. It's one of 7 areas that are part of the Ford Foundation's mission. What's interesting about our focus on inequality is that Ford has had a very rich history of funding the arts sector nationwide and very broadly, and helping to build the arts sector through, obviously founded in Detroit in 1936, but Ford helped to build systems like the resident theaters across the country, contributed to the building of orchestras, and funded organizations and artists of color and diverse artists for the first time, from Negro Ensemble to Dance Theater of Harlem, Arthur Mitchell, helped to found those organizations. What is unique and challenging in our turn to focus on inequality is that we are really narrowing our focus and focusing on the artists and creative makers, because we recognize that they have been in the forefront, making social change, leading change through their work, through their advocacy. And so we are really standing beside those artists in helping to hold up their work. Darren Walker did a sort of a wonderful analysis that I almost think he did in real time in really narrating and being very public about the strategic analysis to frame for the public why he thought inequality was essential for us to focus on. And it was really his work traveling all over the world. Ford does fund globally, in Africa, in Indonesia, in Latin America, and in the United States. But he kept seeing sort of these universal conditions of deep poverty and a deep chasm between people who were poor because of systems. And he looked at the drivers. What was driving that inequality? And among those drivers were, a history of deep discrimination against women, against caste minorities, against racial minorities and ethnic minorities, but also these narratives that had been created by those systems that kept to perpetuate sort of the undervaluing of many minorities and women. And so in our focus in creativity and free expression, I work in funding the arts with a team that includes a very robust film program called Just Films that supports documentary filmmaking as well as investigative journalism. And we focus on work that tells stories from these sort of historically undervalued communities. Sometimes we refer to them as marginalized. We are conflicted about that, but historically under-recognized and valued communities, diverse communities. So that is the focus of our work. We are trying to be very strategic about raising up content in that way, but we also fund organizations and networks that are all similarly dedicated to raising up those stories across arts, film, and journalism. We also have a new approach that we are focused on. About a third of our funding is dedicated to organizational development of organizations and networks. And that was, Darren Walker felt very strongly that we were, he wanted to be careful about over-programming or over-prescribing how we work with, to your point, Kamilah, how we work with our partners who work on our mission. And so about a third of our funding goes to organizations, again, invested in our mission for development, for strategic planning, for building infrastructure, for building leadership and capacity.
That's fantastic. Margaret mentioned that word narratives, and a colleague of hers is an extraordinary poet called Elizabeth Alexander, and I've heard Elizabeth often quote Gwendolyn Brooks and say, wait, I looked up the quote, so I want to get it right. One wants a teller in a time like this. And so thinking about that and thinking about your focus on, or Ford's focus on diasporan communities, particularly in your program. If someone's going to come to you and approach the Ford Foundation and say, I am doing a program that's going to address racial equity in the arts, I'm doing a program that's going to address diversity and inclusion in the arts, I'm going to do some sort of outreach program, what are the kinds of things that they need to be prepared to talk about with you? I mean, presumably not all of these programs are equal, right? So what are some of the things that you're especially looking for within the arts and culture portfolio?
I would say in a macro way, to what extent can that idea be a model for the field? One of the common threads among film, arts, and journalism is a lack of diverse leadership, for example. So, and that's something that, Mellon helps inform our work, has historically helped inform our work. And so that's an area where we would—
And vice versa.
Where we would look to see, how does that idea help raise up, either raising content that is diverse, or how does it help develop leaders in that genre or across genre? Is it a model that is replicable, and is it? And so we are happy to work on helping invest in models, so long as they have the potential to serve sort of a larger field that is of importance.
And I think that sort of national model thing is really important for those of us who are grant seekers to pay attention to when we're coming after national funding, right? Because at least in the US, you're sitting there looking across 50 states, you're looking across whatever we are, 316 million people, you have a somewhat limited budget and have to make some decisions. So you're really looking for something that's new, that's different, that's additive to the national scene. Now, Kamilah, you sit in a very different geographic place, right? You're focused, laser-like focus, on the 7 counties that are your area. So when you're looking at a project, if someone comes to you and says, I want to begin addressing diversity, inclusion, and equity in the arts in Southeast Michigan, what kinds of things are you looking for? What is something that sort of stands out and rises to the top of the pile?
First thing I'd ask is, whose idea was this? And are the people who are intended to be served by this project, were they a part of the visioning as it was being created and designed? Who was sitting at that table saying, hey, I have a great idea? And how many people from how many different spaces across the community got to have a say? So whose idea was it? And then also, I'd say, sometimes when people are trying something new and want support in those early stages, it's really important to know what their resources were, what their maybe a good way to say it is what the data was that they pulled from, what research did they rely on, to give them a sense of there's something going on in this neighborhood or community that does need to be addressed. I want to know where the idea came from. And so sometimes sharing what the research is, where the data came from, really gives a sense of who's ultimately going to be served. And so that starting place becomes really critical for me. And that the data, the research, is disaggregated to the best extent possible is absolutely critical as well. So rather than saying the Macomb County area needs this, we know for sure, it's which people in Macomb, in which neighborhoods, and how do you know? Where'd you get that information from? What's telling you that those particular people have this interest? Did they tell you themselves? I hope so. I hope you asked them. So that's what I'm usually thinking about.
I think that's so important, and that notion of sort of disaggregating data, right? Because we can say this is going to benefit Macomb County, but if we let systems sort of default to the way that systems work, it's not really going to hit everyone equally. So that notion of sort of getting into that fine-grained stuff, and because you're deeply rooted in a place, you know it. Mellon, my experience at least with Mellon, is that you guys have an incredibly long courtship, and then you invest deeply right? And that you sort of want to really get to know an organization, understand an issue, come to a common shared vision. So as you're going through that courtship, what are the things you're looking for? What do you want to see in an organization become a partner of you in the work that you're trying to further?
The long courtship, I think, it's an interesting to hear that perspective, Jamie. Sometimes that's the case, and sometimes we know absolutely instantly in the single meeting that this is a fantastic idea. The leadership is in place. There is an authentic voice being spoken on behalf of the organization, that it permeates through board, through staff, through artists. Sometimes that, sometimes that takes a long time, and sometimes we know instantly. But you're right. We often begin with a planning grant, a year-long grant that doesn't even go to our trustees. They're approved by our officers. That will lead to multi-year funding. Our grants, on average, are 3-year grants, not always, sometimes longer, sometimes less. And we go into those relationships expecting that we will renew them for 1 or 2 cycles, which is fantastic as long as it lasts. It's very difficult to move away from those relationships because, unlike my colleagues in higher education who are graduating a class of alumni every year that are going to have lifelong loyalty to their institutions and over time may become donors, the arts don't have that benefit. So arts organizations, of course, are competing with their own communities, with other nonprofit sectors. And we're very conscious when we enter into a relationship that it may not be possible to sustain a program after we exit it.
That's fantastic. So this is where I want to pivot and sort of get a little specific about sort of where we are in the audience we're in. Some of this is informed sort of by where I've been sitting for the past 3 months, year, 10 years, 30 years. But I found it really important to dig into some of the assumptions underneath our work and to really make sure we're clear on sort of why we're doing what we're doing. And there are at least 2 ways to read the interest in the symphony orchestra world and the classical music world in terms of wanting to embrace these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And one is the one that I think is a conversation we're used to having, right? It's the right thing to do. People are understanding it. We need to keep making these efforts. You know, I was at the New York Philharmonic in 1995. We were talking about these, so we're beginning to get into that 30-year sweet spot of where maybe real change is possible. So I think we're familiar with that. The other version, and the conversation that I haven't heard a lot in public, is should we be spending this much time and resources trying to integrate a symphony orchestra when it is possible to read a symphony orchestra as a culturally specific organization, right? If I look at the repertory, I was trying to pull up the League of American Orchestra statistics, 98% of symphonic repertory is composed by Western European males, mostly. And so if it's a culturally specific organization, do we need to begin thinking about it the way we would think about a taiko drumming organization, right? We don't worry that there are too many Japanese Americans involved with taiko drumming. We know that the vast majority of people are going to be interested in that or that, and it's fine. And we fund an ecosystem that's a very different ecosystem than what we funded in classical music. So as you guys are thinking about sort of where we sit, are we asking the right questions? Are we doing it for the right reasons? Is this, in fact, a sort of waking up and embracing of the world as we know it? Or is this a play to say, I've got all the marbles, I want to keep them, and in order to keep them, I got to let a few other people in the game? So this is meant to be a provocative question. This is meant to get us thinking. This is meant to sort of get us off our automatic, sort of tape loop of this. So in many ways, this conversation is Margaret's fault because she and I flew in together this morning. So we started this conversation. So let me start with you, Margaret, and then we'll come down.
So, I actually think that, the business model, obviously, of orchestras, like business model of all nonprofit arts organizations, there's a universal issue there and challenge for the nonprofit arts model, and orchestras are deeply, a victim of that now. I mean, we talk about it may have run its course in terms of, the 60, 70 years, and we must look for different models to sustain funding the arts across the board, including orchestras. Obviously, we all believe in integrating opportunities, and yes, should we continue to help orchestras integrate orchestras? Absolutely. It's an art form that we do value. For me, it's a matter of, and for Ford, it's a matter of priority. We helped, build nonprofit theaters and orchestras at a time where it was disruptive, and it was important to spread culture across the United States, not just in the big cities. So, and that is good. It is a different time today, and today we feel that it's important to help build individuals and leaders, and that's why I'm here. We are deeply invested in Sphinx because we believe that helping to develop professional musicians, is the most important thing for the community, for the individual, and actually will ultimately lead to being disruptive for the orchestra. So I don't think it's I don't think they're mutually exclusive, those goals.
Right. Spoiler alert, it's never either or. It's always both and form, right? I mean, that's the secret. That's always the answer. Kamilah, you work in an unbelievably culturally rich part of the world, right? The 7 counties have all sorts of voices, all sorts of cultures, all sorts of traditions. You have an incredibly rich tapestry of folks here. What gets to be universal? What gets to sort of claim this is universal culture that everyone should have access to, and what is sort of specific and it's all right if only some of us have access to? Does that inform your work? Is that a lens through which you are thinking or looking?
So I hope this doesn't sound too mushy, but I hope there's nothing universal other than access, if that makes any sense at all. I hope that there's no one thing that we're all thinking is going to be that's going to work for everyone.
Exactly.
I'd say though, when I'm thinking about, even as a former professional dancer, classical dance it had started to, when I was in graduate school, take many different, people were starting to redefine and starting to say, well, when I say classical dance, I don't just mean ballet. I mean this, and this. It depends on where you sit, where you're rooted, where you came from, as to what you might refer to as classical. And so in these communities and neighborhoods that we're serving, it feels the same to me. Which neighborhood are we sitting in? And what's classical to them? And we do have to lift that up and be very thoughtful and intentional and absolutely respectful and take it so seriously that wherever we find ourselves rooted, wherever we find ourselves funding, those are the people who decide what's classical to them, and what's classical to them 2 blocks away might be a very different thing. But then I want to say, what's coming to mind for me is, how we define and define again and change a word, play a semantics game, and then say, oh, this is my definition of equity or creative placemaking. I changed these 5 words and now I have a new definition. I think we over-define too much, and it takes us away from, it almost is a distraction from what the heart of the matter is, which is how can we possibly make it so that anybody that wants to have a particular experience can have it. And if it needs to be at free or low cost or no cost or whatever it is, if it needs to cost a lot so people can value it and see it as something that's worth their attention, however that might happen, how do we get it so that as many people as might want to be participating in something can? And so that's how I'm thinking about it. So classical, call it what you want, give it a label, don't give it a label, but then I'm looking down inside the heart of the work to say, who's actually going to come and have the experience? Who's going to be served? Who's not going to be served? Who's not invited? Who doesn't feel welcome? And so the last thing I'll say is thinking in terms of the word welcome and who benefits, thinking about real and perceived inside of that. So we can say, as funders, everybody's welcome to apply, And then someone might say, so what? That doesn't mean I actually showed up and submitted a proposal and got my work funded and moved something on the ground. So it's that real and perceived welcoming, a real and perceived place at the table, real and perceived participation. It's real and perceived classical, you know. It's just...
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. That's good. Susan, you and I, was it last June, were with Earl Lewis at the League of American Orchestras. And Earl Lewis is the president of the Mellon Foundation, comes out of an academic institution, thinks a lot about the canon, right? Thought about that and how we needed to define and redefine and maybe uncapitalize and pluralize the notion of canons in the academy. And when you sort of think about the canon in the music world, how do you approach that? Sort of, are there canonical works? Are there things that achieve that? Is that not a useful frame that we should borrow?
Of course there are canonical works, but thinking back to what my colleagues have said, Western orchestral music may have been written, composed by and large by white Europeans historically, but that language has managed to permeate cultures internationally and speak to many, many peoples of all sizes, shapes, and colors. The way I can love Indian classical music or Indonesian gamelan, I think you look at Suzuki students in Japan, you look at East-West Divan Orchestra, you look at students at Settlement Music School in Philadelphia, you look at Chuck's Iceola musicians, and this music speaks because of the sounds rather than who wrote it. And I think what has gotten lost along the way is that at a young age, young people want to learn these canonical works. And somewhere between their earliest studies and the conservatory environment that was talked about at this first panel, those access and opportunity points have become inequitable. And I think what we're trying to do as funders is to ensure that anyone that wants to become a classical musician and play in an orchestra or an opera company or a string quartet or be a community organizer and a teaching artist has that opportunity.
I think that's really great. So I want to give you guys a heads up because we've done speaking of welcome, we've done the wonderfully welcoming thing of putting 2 stationary microphones on either side of the room. So if you would like to join us in conversation, you have to leave your seat and walk to one of them. So I'm going to ask one more question up here and then would love to get some voices from the room in. So please head to either one of those mics if you have something you'd like to add to the conversation. While we're waiting for that, while we're sort of thinking about this world, what have you seen, I'll start with Susan and go back down, what have you seen in the last year that's really excited you? Who's someone who's getting something really right? What's something that's really given you hope and said, yes, this is different?
Oh, Jamie, I think there are an incredible number of bright spots in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion going on right now. And I look around this room and I see the Cincinnati Symphony College Conservatory of Music fellowship program that's underway. I see Iceola, I see the African American program fellowship that Detroit Symphony has had for more than 25 years. I see how much Paul has accomplished in 7 months at CIM. And what I'm seeing and hearing is a lack of excuses that we can't solve this problem and an opportunity to really come together and make it work. The program I'm proudest of is one we have just funded at Mellon, which is the Philadelphia Music Alliance for Youth, which comes out of Settlement Music School and is an alliance of 15 organizations in Philadelphia involved in music training, 10 of which are doing instrumental music. They are playing in the sandbox together. They are putting their students before their individual institutions and saying, we can work together to identify talent, to nurture these pathways, and to make sure students don't fall off, to make sure their parents are involved, to make sure that they can get to their music lessons even if we have to carpool them. And that is more important than any one of our own institutions. And that makes me feel very excited.
That's awesome. What's one thing that gives you energy that you've seen? Not the most important, doesn't have to be the best, not superlative. Just something that gives you energy and hope.
When I see people heading to the other side of the spectrum, so like thinking of arts education along a continuum where on one side you've got that just exposure experience, that lecture demonstration, And then all the way on the other side, you have that mastery, that sense of artistry, seeing oneself as a performer or creating artwork. I think the thing that makes my heart flutter is when I see Black and brown children on that end of the spectrum. And when I see people envisioning providing experiences for Black and brown children that are all the way at that end, and that they have confidence and are taking the responsibility to make it so that even if they start off with a lecture demonstration, that then they make significant and intentional investments to bring them all the way to the other end, where they can have a choice as to whether they might keep picking up that instrument and play for the world, or whether they might just decide, well, this is enough for me, but at least they have the choice. So it's that side of things where I
love
could
that.
start crying.
Margaret, what's a moment of excitement or energy before we get some of these voices to join us?
Moment of inspiration, and then I want one coda
Yeah,
from
please.
your last question. A moment of inspiration was hearing Kerry James Marshall speak last week. Kerry James Marshall is an artist, visual artist. He had a major show at the Met. His mission is to introduce Black portraiture into the landscape, into the visual arts landscape, and he's probably the first living artist to have a major retrospective at the Met. He talked about practice, and he grew up in the projects in Los Angeles, and he talked about going to and seeing art and trying to create a strategy for himself for how he could become an artist. And he decided that making things would teach him how to paint like Leonardo da Vinci. And when he started to learn things in wood shop and folk ed, he decided that making things would set him free and would make him free. And that his talk about process was sort of really thrilling to me. A coda about orchestras and why it's important to integrate them, to sustain them. We have to remember that classical musicians are artists, and like the dancer who has to dance, it's the only thing they can do as a professional. We must remember that orchestras are not just about presenting, but they are giving musicians a platform for expression. And if for any reason it's important to sustain this platform, because it's a platform for expression for individual artists.
I think that's fabulous. So we've got some interest. So what I'd love to do is invite a couple of voices to join us. We'll stack up a couple of comments, questions, and then we'll sort of respond up here. So let me start over here. Would you just say a word about who you are and then share what you'd like to bring into the room?
Yes, I'm Patrice Floyd. I'm the founder of Javasia Arts Conservatory. We're 37 years old in Tallahassee, Florida.
Great to see you.
How close are we to moving towards actually, when you're submitting grants and when you're reviewing grants, how close are we to forcing the issue a little bit? And this is what I mean by forcing the issue. Making certain that when we have inclusionary clauses in what they, so far as outreach, people have to have so many minorities, or it has to be a minority-driven program or whatever. How close are we to insisting on some of the platforms that they're blind auditions? You know what blind auditions are? That's the wall where people they can't see the person, they can only hear the person, so far as music is concerned. And also, how soon can we get to making certain that they are following the objectives that you have asked them to follow? Because sometimes what we're finding is that more investigation work underneath after the grant is submitted or after funds have been given to an orchestra or to a school, to make certain that they are doing everything they can to make sure that now that they've included an individual, that they are supporting the individual and that they are consistent about it. And I'm saying about forcing the change because it's almost silly to think that we can change people's mindsets even when they're the best. Because as teachers, we see it every day. You could be the very best, but if you have somebody who's been on that faculty 40 years who doesn't believe in inclusion, that can keep a minority student out just because of one tenured person's mindset. So what are we going to do from the funding side to help change that, to force the hand a little bit, even in the presentation of music in the orchestras? Yes, Western music is wonderful, but if we're funding an orchestra, we have to make sure they're playing a William Grant Steele piece of music, things like that.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. So I heard issues around accountability, forcing urgency, insistence, and supporting. Hi, please join us. Say a word about who you are.
Good morning. My name is David France, and I'm an African-American violinist from Boston. 3.5 years ago, while I was homeless, I started an organization called Revolution of Hope, which exists to transform the lives of inner-city youth through a world-class youth orchestra. And so our first youth orchestra is called the Roxbury Youth Orchestra, which is a 3-hour-a-day after-school orchestra in Roxbury. So in Boston, whenever I go to events of programs that are inclusive around the arts and around social change, the people who have started those programs don't look like the communities that they're from. And then now in my 5 years in Boston, when I've met the people who are from those communities who have started similar programs, they are the least funded. And so I wonder, I think these days it's very hip to talk about funding inclusion, but I would love the conversation of the panelists to broaden around the question of, is there an exclusivity in the funding of those who are working in, who are creating these inclusive programs?
Excellent, thank you for that. So I heard a big question about, is it the same thing to give, I'll just use myself as an example, a white male money to help a community of color? Is it different to give a community of color money to help itself? As a sort of not great summary of what you were saying. Thank you for that. Let me just invite your voice in, please.
Good morning, my name is Angelica Durrell from Stamford, Connecticut. We run the Native Instrument Academy, the Inter-Music Organization. My question is, what is your position as a funder on transformational funding to smaller organizations that have a proven track record and model, are at a perhaps $250,000 budget, but need a large infrastructural investment to scale it? And what do we need to present to you so that we can be eligible and competitive for national level funding?
Great, thank you for that. A version of that I often hear is philanthropy is very good at giving money to big organizations.
Correct.
But we're not always so good at growing organizations into joining the ranks of the big as that. So let me invite Philip's voice in, and then would love to hear some thoughts from you guys.
Hello, everybody. My name is Philip Gralty, and I'm the executive director and co-founder of a new music ensemble and nonprofit startup called Bridge to Everywhere, which is based in Los Angeles. And our core mission is to support composers of color and minority composers, such as women. And my question to the panel, and curtailing off of some of the questions that we've already heard, is how do foundations support emerging leaders like myself who are trying to start organizations but who don't have capacity yet, who don't have experience as executive directors or as arts managers, when so many of the grants that are available to organizations require a 2 or 3 year life cycle for the nonprofit, or require certain operating budgets which you don't have as a startup. What can you do as funders to help to support young leaders like myself who are trying to launch organizations with no capacity?
Awesome. All right, so let's pause there. So some of the things we heard is, when are funders going to get serious and put our money where our mouth is and say, this is what we want to see, and if we don't see this, we're not going to do it? How does the leadership of an organization need to look like the community that it is hoping to serve? Is that something that we should insist on as one of the things? And then both for sort of smaller and newer organizations and for younger leaders, how do we actually help them get to the point where they could be competitive and get into the ranks of folks considered for a Ford or a Mellon grant? Because in philanthropy, a lot of times I think we use the word infrastructure as a sort of code word for not wanting to give money to smaller organizations, right? We'll say they don't have enough infrastructure for us to invest in, but when you dig into that, the definition of infrastructure, number of staff members and amount of money in your bank account, which we could fix by giving them money. So as you think about those things, Kamilah, I haven't made you start anywhere yet, so we'll come to the middle. As you're thinking about those, don't take them one by one, but as you're sort of thinking about those issues, which really sort of lay out the questions that you ask as a grant maker, where is your head?
I'd say for these folks who are coming from around the country asking these questions about access to transformational funding for small organizations, funding for organizations that have smaller infrastructures, that are newer, that are led by people of color and serve people of color, maybe find your community foundation. We are looking for groups that are absolutely standing face to face with the people that they're serving. And so while some of our funding does absolutely get directed toward institutions, larger cultural institutions around the region, and it's probably the same with other community foundations around the country, a lot of our work is very thoughtfully focused on how many, so for example, in the Brightmoor neighborhood in Detroit, how many organizations can we actually invite to apply? How many show up? And when they don't show up, how many do I have responsibility as the program officer to call? And then call again if the phone's cut off, and then call again, then email, then ask a friend to send a message to say, hey, this funding is available for you to have access to. And then once you've come to say, okay, so I am actually interested in applying for this, then there's also the possibility that there's a need for some capacity building. And so some of those requests can be part of grants with community foundations. You can ask for funding for evaluation. You can ask for funding for your own personal training so you can elevate your craft as a leader of the organization. So I'd say there's a whole lot of exciting stuff that's happening at community foundations that's actually even more accessible than people might realize.
Yeah.
That's a great point, Kamilah. And I would also say, look to your state and local arts councils. Arts councils, I was a public funder in New York City, and we funded arts councils for things like leadership development programs. Actually through, it's obviously a very large public funder with great capacity, which is the City of New York. But we shaped leadership program for emerging leaders. So I would say, look to philanthropy for, and look to different arts funders for different types of things.
Absolutely.
We can't all do the same thing, or we won't do anything well. But you have to be strategic about targeting. But I would say state and local arts councils. We, Susan and I, and other national funders fund a number of networks that do provide some really strong leadership development programs, like the National Association of Latino Arts Councils, which is the first one that comes to mind. The League of Orchestras has amazing programs. But the person from LA, I think, who asked that, I'm happy to help with ideas or strategize for sources and technical services in your
Be careful, because I know
area.
Philip and I know Margaret, so I can
Okay.
actually make this happen.
I'm
Susan,
really sympathetic to these questions, and I thank you for raising them. It's the sort of stuff that keeps us up at night. My budget annually is about $25 million, which sounds like a tremendous amount of money and is probably the largest for arts funding. If you divide that among 50 states, that's $500,000 per state. So we're trying constantly to balance depth and breadth. And one of the ways we do that is through our re-granting programs. Margaret has mentioned several of them. National Art Strategies has an online program at the University of Pennsylvania that gives you a master's for very, very little money. The League's program, Theater Communications Group, National Association for Latino Arts and Culture, First Peoples Fund, all have leadership development programs that we're trying to fund. Again, our re-granting programs try to get to some of the smaller organizations. I like to say we fund leadership at all levels, at all sizes, and I really do believe that. But our grant-making process is arduous. And I think you also have to remember that we are not donors, we are funders. We report to a board of directors who have very strong feelings. They encourage us to fund risk, but it's finding high risk, high benefit is the preference. and they will question our decisions. So we have to be really, really careful on the decisions we make as to who we can invite in and who we have to direct to other kinds of opportunities that we're trying to support.
That's fantastic. So this is the bad news, good news portion. The bad news is that the clock is blinking at me because we are already over time. The good news is that these are honestly 3 of the most accessible, approachable colleagues who really are interested in generously engaging in the public. So I think everyone can hang out at least a little bit after this panel. No one has to run to get off. So with that, let me please ask you to join me in thanking these panelists for sharing their time with us today.